The phone rang at 8:30 on a Tuesday evening, cutting through the silence of my living room. 3 years. 3 years of complete silence, and now my mother's voice trembled through the speaker, but not with remorse. She wanted something. My father needed a place to stay. My sister lost her apartment. The whole family needed to move into my newly purchased home, worth $234,000. The same family who threw me out at 19 with $22 and my belongings stuffed into a garbage bag. I stared at my phone screen, watching my mother's name flash as the call continued. My hands shook slightly as I held the device, memories flooding back like a dam had burst in my mind. The last time I heard her voice, she was screaming at me to get out and never come back. Now here she was, speaking in that familiar manipulative tone I remembered so well, acting like nothing had ever happened between us. My beautiful ranch-style home in suburban Denver suddenly felt smaller as her words echoed in my ears. The hardwood floors I had saved for months to install, the granite countertops I worked overtime to afford, the 3 bedrooms I filled with furniture bought piece by piece with money I earned through blood, sweat, and tears. This was my sanctuary. My proof that I had made something of myself despite their abandonment. The irony was not lost on me. The son they discarded like trash was now successful enough to own property they desperately needed. But as I listened to my mother explain their situation, with carefully chosen words that avoided any acknowledgement of the past, I felt that familiar knot forming in my stomach. The same feeling I had when I was 19 and completely alone in the world. She spoke about family obligations and how blood is thicker than water, completely ignoring the fact that she had made it crystal clear 3 years ago that I was no longer considered family. There was no apology in her voice, no recognition of the pain they had caused, just expectation that I would welcome them with open arms, because they were in trouble. I found myself gripping the phone tighter as she continued her rehearsed speech about needing a temporary place to stay. Temporary. That word hung in the air like smoke. Nothing about my family was ever temporary. Once they settled somewhere, they planted roots deep and became impossible to remove. I had learned that lesson the hard way when I was still living under their roof. The house around me felt different now, violated somehow, just by the knowledge that they knew where I lived and how much my property was worth. They had clearly done their research before making this call. This was not a desperate plea from a loving family. This was a calculated move from people who saw me as their financial salvation. As my mother finished her request and waited for my response, I closed my eyes and tried to center myself. The scared 19-year-old boy who left their house with nothing was gone. In his place stood a man who had built his own life from the ground up. But could that man withstand the emotional manipulation that was surely coming my way? My mind drifted back to that horrible night 3 years ago, when everything changed forever. I was 19, working 2 part-time jobs while attending community college during the day. Mornings at a coffee shop, evenings at a grocery store, barely getting enough sleep but determined to build a future for myself. I lived at home to save money, contributing $300 a month to help with household expenses, even though my parents never asked for it. The night that destroyed my family started like any other. I came home from my evening shift at 10:30, exhausted but satisfied that I was making progress toward my goals. I had just been accepted into the business program at Colorado State University and was planning to transfer the following semester. Life felt like it was finally moving in the right direction. But as I walked through the front door, I heard shouting coming from the living room. My father's voice, thick with alcohol and rage, was berating my 12-year-old brother Tommy for something trivial. I could hear Tommy crying, and that sound cut through me like a knife. My little brother was the only good thing in that toxic household, and I had spent years protecting him from our father's drunken outbursts. When I rounded the corner into the living room, I saw my father standing over Tommy, his fist raised and ready to strike. Without thinking, I stepped between them, catching my father's arm before he could hit my brother. "Leave him alone," I said firmly, trying to keep my voice calm. "Hess, just a kid." That simple act of protection triggered an explosion of rage I had never seen before. My father turned his fury on me, shouting about respect and authority while my mother watched from the kitchen doorway without intervening. He accused me of undermining his parenting and destroying the family structure. The smell of whiskey on his breath was overwhelming as he got in my face, spittle flying as he screamed. "You think you're better than me," he yelled, his face red with anger. "Living in my house, eating my food, and now you want to tell me how to raise my kids." The accusations flew fast and furious, each one designed to cut deeper than the last. He called me ungrateful, disrespectful, and a cancer on the family. When I tried to explain that I was just protecting Tommy, my mother finally spoke up. But instead of defending me or calming the situation, she sided with my father completely. "You are destroying this family, Jeffrey," she said coldly, her words hitting harder than any physical blow could have. "Your father works hard to provide for us, and this is how you repay him." The next hour was a blur of humiliation and heartbreak. They forced me to pack my belongings while they watched, making sure I didn't take anything they considered theirs. 3 years of my life were reduced to whatever could fit in a black garbage bag: my clothes, a few books, some personal items that held sentimental value, and the $22 I had in my wallet from my shift that evening. Tommy stood in his bedroom doorway, tears streaming down his face as he watched me pack. "Please don't leave," he whispered when our parents were not looking. "I'm sorry, this is my fault." I pulled him into a quick hug and promised him this was not his fault, that I would find a way to stay in touch. But even as I said those words, I knew our parents would never allow it. As I walked out the front door with my garbage bag slung over my shoulder, my mother called after me. "Don't come back," she said flatly. "You made your choice. Now live with it." The door slammed shut behind me, and I stood on the front step of the house. I had called home for 19 years, officially homeless, and completely alone. That first night, I slept in my beat-up Honda Civic in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, too proud to call any friends at midnight, and too broke to afford even a cheap motel room. The car was cramped and cold, but it was private enough for me to finally let myself cry without anyone seeing. I had lost everything in the span of 2 hours, and I had no idea how I was going to survive. The next few days were a crash course in survival. A friend from community college, Marcus, let me sleep on his couch for a week while I figured out my next move. Another friend, Sarah from the coffee shop, helped me find a tiny studio apartment that rented for $450 a month. It was in a rough neighborhood, barely 300 square feet, and had a leaky faucet that the landlord refused to fix. But it was mine. Working 2 jobs suddenly became about survival rather than saving for college. Every dollar went to rent, utilities, food, and basic necessities. The business program at Colorado State would have to wait. My dreams of higher education were put on hold indefinitely while I focused on keeping a roof over my head and food in my stomach. The emotional devastation was worse than the financial struggle. I had spent my entire life believing that family meant unconditional love and support. Learning that my parents could discard me so easily shattered something fundamental in my worldview. The people who were supposed to love me most had chosen to abandon me when I tried to protect an innocent child. For the next 2 years, I threw myself into rebuilding my life from the ground up. I picked up a third part-time job on weekends, saved every penny I could, and slowly began to see progress. My credit score improved. I was able to move to a better apartment, and I even started taking night classes at the community college again. The dream of transferring to a 4-year university was still alive, just delayed. But the real breakthrough in understanding what my family had done to me came unexpectedly on a random Saturday afternoon. I was grocery shopping at the King Soopers near my apartment when I ran into my Aunt Sarah, my mother's younger sister. We had always been close when I was younger, and she had been like a second mother to me during my childhood. When she saw me pushing a cart through the produce section, her reaction was not the warm greeting I expected. Instead, her face went completely white, like she was seeing a ghost. She dropped the bag of apples she was holding and just stared at me for several long seconds before speaking. "Jeffrey," she whispered, looking around nervously, as if she expected someone else to appear. "What are you doing here? I thought you were in prison, or dead." Her words hit me like a physical blow, and I stood there confused, unable to process what she had just said. "Prison," I repeated, genuinely bewildered. "Aunt Sarah, what are you talking about? I work 3 jobs and go to school. Why would you think I was in prison?" The confusion in my voice must have registered with her because her expression slowly shifted from shock to something resembling horror. She grabbed my arm and pulled me to a quieter corner of the store, near the pharmacy section where we could talk privately. "Your parents told everyone that you had serious drug problems," she said quietly, her voice shaking. "They said you were stealing from them, using heroin, and had gotten involved with dangerous people." The grocery store suddenly felt like it was spinning around me. "That's completely false," I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange in my own ears. "I don't use drugs. I've never stolen anything, and I've been working constantly just to survive." "Why would they tell you that?" Aunt Sarah's face crumpled as the truth began to dawn on her. Over the next 20 minutes, standing in that grocery store, she revealed the full extent of the lies my family had spread about me. According to their version of events, I had stolen $3,000 from my father's work fund before disappearing into the night. They claimed I had threatened my mother physically and had been terrorizing Tommy with violent behavior. The stories got even worse from there. Extended family members had been told that I had joined a gang and was involved in drug dealing. Old family friends were warned to stay away from me because I was dangerous and unpredictable. Church members were asked to pray for my soul because I had fallen into a life of crime and addiction. "They said you broke into the house twice to steal more money," Aunt Sarah continued, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Your mother called me crying about how afraid she was of what you might do next. We all believed them, Jeffrey. We had no reason not to." The magnitude of their betrayal was staggering. Not only had they thrown me out and cut off contact, but they had systematically destroyed my reputation with anyone who might have offered help or support. They had isolated me completely, ensuring that even if I tried to reach out to extended family or family friends, I would be met with suspicion and fear. "Tommy tried to defend you," Aunt Sarah said quietly. "About 6 months after you left, he called me crying and saying that none of the stories were true. But your parents said he was just confused and traumatized by your behavior. They sent him to counseling and told everyone that you had psychologically damaged him. Learning that my little brother had tried to stand up for me while I was gone broke something inside me that I didn't know was still intact. He was just 12 years old when this all started, and he had been brave enough to tell the truth while facing pressure from our parents. The guilt I felt for not being there to protect him was overwhelming." As Aunt Sarah and I talked, more details emerged about how thoroughly my character had been assassinated. My mother had shown family members fake text messages, supposedly from me, asking for drug money and making threats. My father had convinced his coworkers that I was a dangerous addict who might show up at his workplace to cause trouble. The lies served multiple purposes, I realized. They justified my parents' decision to throw me out by making me the villain of the story. They garnered sympathy and support for my family, while ensuring that no one would question their version of events. And most importantly, they prevented anyone from helping me or maintaining a relationship with me that might contradict their narrative. Aunt Sarah apologized profusely for believing their stories without question, but I could not bring myself to blame her. The lies were detailed and consistent, delivered by people she trusted completely. She had no reason to doubt them, especially when they painted such a clear picture of a troubled young man who had gone off the rails. That conversation in the grocery store changed everything for me. The hurt I had been carrying for 2 years transformed into something else entirely: righteous anger. My family had not been content with simply removing me from their lives. They had worked deliberately and systematically to destroy any possibility of me building connections with people who knew me growing up. I left that store with a new understanding of exactly who my family really was, and what they were capable of when it served their interests. The scared 19-year-old boy who had left their house with a garbage bag was gone forever, replaced by a man who now understood that some people will stop at nothing to protect their own image, even if it means destroying someone they claim to love. Armed with this new knowledge about my family's lies, I decided to do some investigating of my own. If they were willing to spread such elaborate stories about me, what other deceptions might they be hiding? I started reaching out to old neighbors and acquaintances, carefully probing for information about how my family was really doing. What I discovered over the next few months painted a picture of a household in complete financial freefall. Mrs. Peterson, who lived next door to my childhood home, was happy to fill me in on the drama she had been witnessing. My father's gambling addiction, which had always been an open secret in our house, had apparently spiraled completely out of control after I left. He lost his job at the plant about 18 months ago, she told me during a phone conversation. Something about missing too many days and showing up drunk. Your mother tried to keep it quiet, but the foreclosure notice was posted right on their front door for everyone to see. The foreclosure explained a lot. My parents had lived in that house for 15 years, and losing it would be devastating both financially and emotionally. But it was also poetic justice. The same people who had thrown me out onto the street were now facing homelessness themselves. Further investigation revealed that my mother's health problems were real and serious. Her diabetes had progressed to the point where she needed expensive insulin and regular medical monitoring. Without my father's health insurance from his job, those medical bills were piling up fast. Mrs. Peterson mentioned seeing ambulances at the house twice in recent months. My sister Amanda's situation was perhaps the most complicated piece of the puzzle. She had 2 young children, ages 4 and 6, and their father had disappeared completely about a year ago. She was working at a Dollar General for minimum wage while trying to raise 2 kids as a single mother. Her apartment had been in a rough part of town, and according to my research, she had been evicted 3 months ago for non-payment of rent. The family car, a 10-year-old Ford Explorer that my father had been so proud of, had been repossessed 6 months earlier. They were relying on public transportation and the kindness of neighbors for basic errands like grocery shopping and medical appointments. The financial pressure must have been crushing, but the most heartbreaking discovery was about Tommy. My little brother, now 15 years old, had been working an after-school job at a local pizza place to help support the family. A 15-year-old kid should be focused on school and friends, not working to help pay his family's bills. The guilt I felt about not being there to help him was overwhelming. Through social media detective work, I learned that Tommy had been trying to contact me for months. He had created fake accounts on various platforms, trying to reach out without our parents knowing. The messages I found broke my heart. He apologized for what happened the night I was kicked out, asked if I was okay, and begged me to call him. One message in particular stayed with me. I know they lied about you, Jeffrey. I told everyone the truth, but nobody believed me. I miss you so much, and I hope you're doing better than we are. I love you, and am sorry. Reading those words from my little brother, knowing he had been defending my honor for years while I had no idea, made me realize that not everyone in my family was beyond redemption. The timeline of their financial collapse coincided almost perfectly with when they had started spreading lies about me. I began to suspect that my father had used the fabricated story about me stealing $3,000 to cover up his own financial mistakes. If he could blame missing money on his drug addict son, no one would question where it had really gone. This theory was confirmed when I managed to have coffee with Jake Morrison, one of my father's former co-workers. Your dad was into his bookie for serious money, Jake told me quietly. We all knew it, but nobody wanted to get involved. When that money went missing from the work fund, we figured it was connected somehow. So my father had not only thrown me out for protecting my brother, he had used my absence to cover up his own theft from his employer. The $3,000 that I supposedly stole had actually been taken by my father to pay gambling debts, and my exile had provided the perfect cover story. The depth of their deception was staggering, but it also explained why they had been so vicious in their campaign to destroy my reputation. They could not afford to have anyone listen to my side of the story, because it might lead to questions about what had really happened to that money. As I pieced together the full picture of my family's situation, I felt a complex mix of emotions. There was satisfaction in knowing that their cruelty had caught up with them. There was sadness for the innocent family members, especially Tommy and Amanda's children, who were suffering because of my parents' mistakes. And there was a growing sense that I held all the power now. They had spent 3 years believing I was living in poverty, addicted to drugs, and barely surviving on the streets. They had no idea that I now owned a beautiful home, had a stable income, and was thriving in ways they had never expected. The irony was delicious, but it also carried tremendous responsibility. 2 weeks after my mother's phone call, I thought I had made it clear that I needed time to think about their request. I had not said yes, but I had not said no either. I was still processing everything I had learned about their situation and trying to figure out what the right response would be. That decision was taken out of my hands on a Thursday evening when I came home from work to find my entire family sitting on my front porch. My first reaction was pure shock. There they were, surrounded by suitcases, cardboard boxes, and garbage bags full of their belongings, scattered across my front lawn. My father sat on my porch steps looking older and more beaten down than I remembered. My mother was crying dramatically, dabbing at her eyes with tissues. Amanda stood near the driveway holding the hands of two small children who looked tired and confused, but it was seeing Tommy that hit me the hardest. My little brother was now 6 feet tall, lanky and awkward in the way teenage boys are, but his face still held the same gentle expression I remembered. When our eyes met, he gave me a small, embarrassed smile and mouthed the word sorry. "Jeffrey, honey," my mother called out as I sat in my car in the driveway, trying to process what I was seeing. We didn't have anywhere else to go. The shelter was full, and we just need somewhere to stay for a few days, until we can figure things out. Neighbors were already starting to come outside to see what was happening. Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street was watering her plants but clearly watching the drama unfold. The Johnsons next door were standing in their front window, not even pretending to mind their own business. This was exactly the kind of public spectacle my family excelled at creating. As I got out of my car and walked toward the porch, my mother launched into what was clearly a prepared speech. "We're your family, Jeffrey. We raised you, fed you, put a roof over your head for 19 years. This is just a temporary situation until your father finds work and we can get back on our feet." The manipulation was immediate and obvious. There was no acknowledgement of how our relationship had ended, no apology for the years of silence, and certainly no mention of the lies they had spread about me. Just an appeal to family obligation and the expectation that I would cave under the pressure of having this conversation in front of my neighbors. My father finally stood up from the porch steps, and I could see that he was sober but looked terrible. His clothes were wrinkled and too big for him, like he had lost weight recently. "Son," he said, using a word he had never used when I actually lived in his house. "I know we've had our differences, but we're still family. We just need a little help getting back on our feet." Amanda approached with her children, and I got my first good look at my niece and nephew. The little girl, who must have been around 6 years old, had Amanda's dark hair and serious expression. The boy was younger, maybe 4, and was clutching a stuffed animal that had seen better days. "Uncle Jeffrey," the little girl said politely. "Mommy says we're going to live with you for a while." The emotional manipulation was expertly orchestrated. They had brought the children specifically because they knew I would have a hard time saying no to innocent kids who had nowhere else to go. Amanda's silent, expectant expression made it clear that she considered my support to be a given, not a request. "We've been living in the car for 3 days," my mother continued, her voice getting higher and more dramatic. "Your sister's babies haven't had a proper meal or a real bed. Surely you're not going to turn your back on your own family when we're in such desperate need." Tommy finally spoke up, his voice deeper than I remembered but still gentle. "Jeffrey, I know this is weird, and I know they probably should have called first, but we really don't have anywhere else to go." At least he acknowledged that showing up unannounced was inappropriate, which was more awareness than the rest of my family seemed to possess. The pressure of the situation was intense. My neighbors were watching, my family was clearly desperate, and there were children involved who had done nothing wrong. The old Jeffrey, the 19-year-old boy who had been trained to prioritize family harmony over everything else, would have immediately invited them inside and figured out the details later. But 3 years of living independently had taught me to recognize manipulation when I saw it. This entire scene was designed to make saying no as difficult as possible. They had deliberately created a public crisis that would force my hand, counting on my desire to avoid looking heartless in front of my neighbors. "Let's go inside and talk about this privately," I said finally, knowing that having this conversation on my front porch was not going to end well for anyone. "But I want everyone to understand that nothing is decided yet. This is just a conversation." My mother's face brightened immediately, as if my willingness to discuss the situation indoors was the same as agreeing to let them move in permanently. My father started picking up boxes, and Amanda began gathering her children's things. Only Tommy seemed to understand that this was not a done deal, giving me a look that was both hopeful and apologetic. As I unlocked my front door and watched my family file into the home I had worked so hard to build, I felt like I was making a terrible mistake. But with children involved and neighbors watching, I did not see any other choice. I just hoped I would not regret this decision for the rest of my life. The house that had been my sanctuary suddenly felt invaded. My family spread out through the living room, taking up space and changing the entire energy of the place. This was exactly what I had been afraid of when my mother first called, and now it was happening whether I had agreed to it or not. For the next week, my family settled into my home with an ease that was both impressive and disturbing. My mother took over my kitchen, rearranging my cabinets and complaining about the lack of proper spices. My father planted himself in my living room recliner, watching television and commenting critically on my choice of cable package. Amanda's children were sweet, but they had clearly been told this was their new home, not a temporary stop. Only Tommy seemed uncomfortable with the situation. He spent most of his time in his makeshift bedroom in my home office, coming out only for meals and quiet conversations with me. During one of these talks, he told me how sorry he was about everything that had happened 3 years ago, and how much he had missed having me in his life. But it was Tommy who inadvertently led me to discover the true extent of my family's deception. On the following Tuesday, I came home from work early and heard my father on the phone in my guest bedroom. The door was partially open, and his voice was loud enough that I could hear every word from the hallway. "Yeah, we're in," he was saying to whoever was on the other end. He bought the whole sob story. "We should be able to establish residency within 30 days, just like you said." My blood ran cold as I realized he was talking about legal strategy, not family reconciliation. I stood frozen in the hallway, listening as my father continued the conversation. The lawyer said as long as we can prove we've been living here and receiving mail, it becomes a lot harder for him to kick us out. And if we can document that he agreed to let us stay in exchange for past debts, we might be able to claim partial ownership. The betrayal was so complete and calculated that I felt physically sick. This had never been about family, or desperation, or needing a temporary place to stay. This was a planned takeover of my home, orchestrated with legal advice and executed with precision. I quietly backed away from the door and went to my own bedroom, where I started searching through the belongings they had brought with them. In my father's duffel bag, underneath some clothes, I found a manila folder that contained documents that made my worst fears look optimistic. There were printouts about Colorado tenant rights and adverse possession laws. There was a consultation form from a legal aid society asking about establishing residency in someone else's home. Most damning of all, there was a handwritten notebook in my father's writing that contained detailed information about my property value, my estimated income based on my job, and a strategy for forcing me to support them long term. One page was titled Jeffrey's Financial Obligations and included calculations about how much money they claimed I owed them for raising me, feeding me, and housing me for 19 years. According to their math, I owed them approximately $47,000, which, coincidentally, was close to my current savings account balance. Another section outlined their plan to make false claims about verbal agreements I had supposedly made to let them live in my house permanently. They had even discussed having Tommy lie on their behalf, though there were notes indicating he had refused to participate in that part of the scheme. The legal research was thorough and sophisticated. They had clearly been planning this for months, not weeks. The phone call from my mother had not been a desperate cry for help. It had been the opening move in a chess game, where they intended to take everything I had worked for. But the most devastating discovery was a series of text messages between my mother and Amanda that I found on a piece of paper with phone numbers and important messages. The handwriting was my mother's, but the content was screenshots of text conversations they had been having about me. Has always been naive and easy to manipulate. One message read, "As long as we make it about family loyalty, Hell Cave has too soft to actually kick us out once we're in." Another message from Amanda replied, "Good. The kids need stability, and I'm tired of working for poverty wages. If he wants to be successful, he can support his family." The casual cruelty of their words was breathtaking. They were not grateful for my potential help or sorry about our complicated history. They viewed me as a resource to be exploited, a soft target who could be manipulated into supporting them indefinitely. The final piece of evidence was a business card for a lawyer who specialized in tenant rights and property disputes. On the back, someone had written consultations scheduled for Friday in my father's handwriting. They were not just planning to stay in my house. They were planning to fight me legally if I tried to remove them. As I sat on my bed surrounded by evidence of their deception, I felt a clarity I had never experienced before. The scared 19-year-old boy who had left their house 3 years ago might have been devastated by this betrayal. But the man I had become was furious, and more importantly, he was ready to fight back. I carefully returned all the documents to their original locations, making sure nothing looked disturbed. If my family wanted to play chess, I would show them that I had learned a few moves of my own during our 3 years apart. They had made the mistake of underestimating me, and that error was going to cost them everything. The house that had felt invaded now felt like a battleground, and I was finally ready to start fighting for what was mine. My family had taught me to be cruel through their own actions, and they were about to discover that their gentle, naive son had grown into someone they should have been afraid to cross. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day executing a plan I had been forming since discovering my family's legal documents. My first stop was to a property law firm downtown, where I paid for an emergency consultation with an attorney who specialized in exactly the kind of situation I was facing. Attorney Patricia Wells listened to my story with the kind of professional detachment that told me she had seen this type of family manipulation before. "The good news is that they haven't established residency yet," she told me after reviewing the timeline. "Colorado requires 30 days of documented residence before someone can claim tenant rights, and it's only been 8 days since they arrived." She advised me to document everything, especially any conversations where they discussed their plans or made demands about staying permanently. "If you can record them talking about their legal strategy or their intentions to claim residency, that would be very helpful for your case," she said. I spent $50 on a small digital recording device, and that evening I engineered a conversation with my father about their plans. "So, how long are you thinking you'll need to stay here?" I asked casually while we were both in the living room. "I just want to plan ahead." His answer was everything I needed. "Well, son, I figure once we get settled in and start receiving our mail here, it makes sense for this to be more of a permanent arrangement. Family should stick together, and you've got plenty of space." He went on to explain how they had already started the process of changing their address with various agencies, and how they considered this their new home. I also recorded a conversation with my mother where she explicitly stated that they had no intention of leaving and that I owed them support because they had raised me. "You wouldn't even be successful if it weren't for us," she said. "The least you can do is share what you have with the family that made you who you are." Armed with these recordings and the legal documents I had photographed, I returned to Attorney Wells the next day. She was impressed with the evidence I had gathered and confident that I had a strong case for immediate eviction. "They've essentially admitted to bad faith intentions," she said. "A judge will see right through their scheme." But I was not content with simply removing them from my house. 3 years of lies and character assassination deserved a more complete response. I decided it was time for the truth to come out, and I knew exactly how to make that happen. My first call was to Aunt Sarah, who had become an ally after learning about my family's deceptions. I asked her to organize a family gathering for that weekend, telling her I had something important to share with everyone. She was happy to help, especially after I explained that it was time for the whole family to know what had really happened 3 years ago. The gathering was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at Aunt Sarah's house, and I made sure my parents knew they were expected to attend. "Jeffrey wants to make an announcement about our living situation," my mother told Aunt Sarah, clearly expecting me to formally welcome them into my home in front of the extended family. That Saturday, I arrived at Aunt Sarah's house with a folder full of documents, my digital recorder, and a determination to finally clear my name. The living room was full of aunts, uncles, and cousins I had not seen in 3 years, many of whom had been avoiding me based on the lies they had been told. I started by addressing the room directly. 3 years ago, I was kicked out of my family's house for protecting my brother Tommy from physical abuse. Since then, my parents have told many of you that I was a drug addict, a thief, and a dangerous person. Today, I want to share the truth about what really happened and what's happening now. The room went silent as I methodically presented my evidence. I played the recordings of my father discussing his legal strategy and my mother talking about manipulating me. I shared the documents showing their research into tenant rights and adverse possession. I showed them the notebook where they had calculated how much money they thought I owed them for being their child. My parents' faces went through a range of emotions during my presentation, from shock to anger to panic. My father tried to interrupt several times, but I kept talking, determined to get the whole truth out before they could start spinning new lies. The reaction from my extended family was swift and decisive. Uncle Mike, my father's older brother, stood up and addressed my parents directly. "I can't believe you've been lying to us for 3 years, he said, his voice shaking with anger. "We turned our backs on this boy because of your stories, and the whole time you were covering up your own failures." Aunt Sarah was crying as she apologized to me again, this time in front of everyone. "Jeffrey, we should have known better. We should have listened to both sides before believing such terrible things about you." The truth about the missing money came out during this confrontation. My father, faced with the evidence and the anger of his own siblings, finally admitted that he had taken the $3,000 from his work fund to pay gambling debts. The story about me stealing it had been fabricated to protect his reputation and avoid criminal charges. My mother's reaction was the most dramatic. She broke down completely, alternating between begging for forgiveness and trying to justify their actions. "We were desperate," she cried. "We didn't know what else to do. Jeffrey was always so successful. We thought he could help us." But I was not interested in their excuses. I stood up and addressed the room one final time. "I want everyone to understand that I was 19 years old when they threw me out with $22 in a garbage bag. I was protecting a 12-year-old child from being beaten, and they punished me for it. For 3 years, I built a life for myself while they spread lies about my character. Now they want to take my home away from me, using the same manipulation and deception they've always relied on." The family gathering ended with my parents being told by their own siblings that they were no longer welcome at family functions until they made serious amends for their behavior. Uncle Mike offered to help Tommy find somewhere stable to live so he would not have to suffer for his parents' mistakes. That evening, I served my family with formal eviction papers that Attorney Wells had prepared. They had 72 hours to remove themselves and all their belongings from my property. The legal document made it clear that any attempt to resist would result in police involvement and possible criminal charges. My father's rage was explosive, but it was the impotent anger of a man who had been outmaneuvered completely. "You ungrateful little bastard," he screamed. "After everything we did for you, this is how you repay us." But his words had no power over me anymore. I had heard the truth about what they really thought of me, and their anger only confirmed that I was doing the right thing. Amanda packed her children's things quietly, finally understanding that her assumption of automatic support had been naive. "I'm sorry, Jeffrey," she said as she loaded boxes into a borrowed car. "I should have known this was wrong." It was the first genuine apology I had received from any of them. My mother made one final attempt at manipulation, claiming that removing them would essentially be murdering her because of her medical condition. "You're killing your own mother," she sobbed dramatically. But I had done my research on local resources, and I provided her with a list of organizations that could help them find appropriate housing and medical care. Only Tommy's departure was difficult for me. He hugged me tightly and promised to stay in touch through his own phone number, not through our parents'. "I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself," he said quietly. "I always knew you weren't the person they said you were." As I watched their car disappear around the corner, loaded down with all their belongings, I felt lighter than I had in years. The truth was finally out. My reputation was restored, and my home was mine again. The scared 19-year-old boy they had thrown away had become a man they could no longer manipulate or intimidate. 3 months later, I stood in my living room arranging furniture that had been displaced during my family's brief invasion, and I marveled at how quiet and peaceful my home felt. The energy was completely different now, filled with the calm that comes from having boundaries that are respected and a space that is truly your own. Tommy had been true to his word about staying in touch. He called me every Sunday evening, and we had built a relationship based on honesty and mutual respect rather than obligation and guilt. He was living with Uncle Mike and his family, thriving in an environment where he was valued for who he was, rather than what he could provide. My brother had shared with me that our parents were staying in a transitional housing facility downtown, receiving help with addiction counseling and financial planning. Amanda and her children were in a family shelter program that was helping her find stable housing and better employment. I felt no guilt about their situation because I knew they were receiving appropriate help from people trained to handle their problems. The most surprising development had been the response from my extended family and old friends. Word had spread quickly about the truth of our situation, and I found myself reconnecting with people I had not spoken to in years. Cousins who had been told to avoid me were reaching out to apologize and rebuild relationships. Family friends who had believed my parents' lies were inviting me to gatherings and celebrations I had been excluded from. Mrs. Peterson, my old neighbor, had even called to tell me how proud she was of how I had handled the situation. "I always wondered about their stories," she admitted. "You were such a good kid." And the person they described just didn't match the boy I remembered. The legal aftermath had been swift and decisive. My family's attempt to establish residency had failed completely, and the evidence I had gathered made it impossible for them to pursue any further legal action. Attorney Wells had been impressed with how thoroughly I had documented their deception, and she used my case as an example in a presentation about protecting homeowners from family manipulation. But the most important change was internal. I had spent 3 years carrying shame and confusion about why my family had rejected me so completely. Learning the truth about their lies and manipulation had lifted a weight I had not even realized I was carrying. I finally understood that their treatment of me had been about their own character flaws, not mine. The experience had taught me that real family is not defined by blood or obligation, but by love, respect, and genuine care for each other's well-being. The people who truly belonged in my life would celebrate my success, not try to exploit it. They would support my growth, not try to manipulate me back into old patterns that served their interests. I had also learned the importance of protecting the life you build for yourself. Boundaries are not selfish when they protect you from people who would take advantage of your kindness. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when that behavior comes from people you care about. My relationship with Tommy had shown me what healthy family connections could look like. We talked openly about our past, our feelings, and our hopes for the future. He respected my boundaries while I supported his goals and dreams. There was no manipulation or guilt, just genuine affection and mutual respect. The financial stability I had worked so hard to achieve was no longer threatened by people who viewed me as a resource to be exploited. I could make plans for my future without worrying about family members who might sabotage my progress for their own benefit. The peace of mind that came with this security was priceless. As I reflected on everything that had happened, I realized that being kicked out at 19 with $22 in a garbage bag had been the best thing that could have happened to me. It had forced me to become independent, self-reliant, and strong enough to protect myself from people who would hurt me. The boy who left that house 3 years ago had been naive and trusting, believing that family love was unconditional and that good intentions were always rewarded. The man who stood in his own home now understood that some people will take advantage of kindness if you let them, and that protecting yourself from those people is not cruel. It's necessary. I had built something beautiful from nothing, and I was not going to let anyone destroy it again. The family that had thrown me away was no longer welcome in the life I had created. But the door remained open for people who could treat me with honesty and respect. Standing in my living room that evening, surrounded by furniture I had chosen and memories I had created, I felt grateful for every difficult lesson I had learned. The pain of being rejected had taught me to value the people who truly accepted me. The struggle of starting over with nothing had taught me to appreciate everything I had earned. Most importantly, I had learned that you can choose your family based on who treats you with love and respect, rather than accepting treatment based on who shares your DNA. The family I was building now was small but genuine, made up of people who celebrated my success rather than trying to profit from it. Looking back, I could see that every challenge had prepared me for the moment when I needed to stand up for myself completely. The scared 19-year-old who had been thrown out in disgrace had become a man who could protect his own interests without apology or guilt. Have you ever had to cut ties with family members who were toxic to your growth and happiness? How did you find the strength to choose your own well-being over family pressure? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below about overcoming family manipulation and building the life you deserve. Thank you for listening to my story and for supporting this channel. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like. Subscribe for more content about overcoming family challenges, and share it with someone who might need to hear that it's okay to protect themselves from people who would take advantage of their kindness. Remember that you deserve relationships built on mutual respect and genuine care, regardless of who those people are in your life.